Have you ever had that feeling of being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Well, that's how my story begins in a small coastal town in the UK. My name is James, and what brought me here wasn't the search for adventure or stories to tell friends over beer-fueled evenings. It was a job, a commission to photograph old British buildings for a history magazine. I, always behind my camera, saw this as the perfect opportunity to explore, learn, and perhaps capture something truly unique. I arrived on an autumn afternoon where the sun was struggling to break through the heavy clouds. The cool air and the salty smell of the sea welcomed me. The town was picturesque, with its stone houses and narrow streets, but there was a silence, a stillness that seemed to whisper ancient secrets. As I walked around, capturing images of the facades and empty streets, the locals watched me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. In one of these exchanges of glances, an older man with a white beard and eyes that carried centuries called me closer. In a gruff voice, he warned me about local traditions and certain places that should be respected, not disturbed. He spoke in such a way that the wind seemed to carry each word straight to my heart, instilling a sense of unease. But I, in my typical arrogance of someone who thinks the world is just scenery to be photographed and explored, ignored the warnings. There was one particular ruin on the edge of the forest that called to me. It was said to be cursed, shrouded in dark legends and unexplained events. It's just folklore, I thought, convinced that it was nothing more than stories to scare tourists. I wanted to capture something truly unique, remember? And so, with my camera in hand and my heart beating an arrogant adventure, I entered the ruins at nightfall. That was the first time, but definitely not the last, that I felt the weight of my decision. The shadows lengthened, and a strange presence began to take shape at the edges of my vision. They were just the beginning of a long night, the longest of my life, where every decision took me deeper into something I could never have imagined. In those ruins, daylight seemed like a distant memory, while the night wove its darkness around me. My flashlight illuminated ancient symbols carved into the cold stones, symbols that, even without understanding, I felt carried serious warnings. With a mocking laugh, I traced my fingers over one of the symbols, as if challenging any entity that dared to prove its existence. It was a mistake that I would feel in every bone of my body, in every whisper of the wind. It wasn't long before noises began to cut through the silence. Footsteps? No, something dragging, something hissing, echoing off the stone walls. The sound didn't come from a specific direction. It seemed to surround me, following my every move. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched by eyes I couldn't see, eyes full of intentions I didn't want to know. I should have turned back. I should have listened to the warnings, but instead I found myself trying to find a way out, a way back into the light. But the ruins seemed to have a life of their own, corridors that changed, doors that appeared where before there had only been stone. It was like a labyrinth, a challenge that tested me, mocking my attempt to escape. With each uncertain step, the feeling of being lost increased, and with it, the dread. The night outside now seemed like a safe place compared to my surroundings. Shadows danced on the walls, forming figures that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. My heart beat at a frantic pace, an orchestra of fear that played just for me in that suffocating darkness. The story, up to this point, has maintained its course towards the unknown, with every shadow, every whisper in the wind, reminding me of the arrogance of disregarding warnings, of invading a sacred place without thinking of the consequences. And I, James, was just beginning to understand the price I would pay for this invasion. Amid the palpable darkness of those ruins, my uncertain steps led me to an even more disturbing discovery. A hidden room, a sanctuary of horrors that should never have been disturbed. Inside, Objects that seemed to have been used in ancient rituals surrounded human remains arranged in a macabre manner. My stomach churned at the sight, and a cold chill ran down my spine. It was real, terrifyingly real. And I was there, alone, witness to ancient, dark secrets. And then the whispers began. At first low, almost inaudible, they grew in intensity, calling my name. "James," they said, with an intimacy that chilled my blood. There was no one there with me, I was sure of it. But the voices, they seemed to come from everywhere, whispering secrets and threats directly into my soul. Outside, the night seemed even denser, a blanket of darkness that no beam of moonlight could penetrate. My only company was the faint light of the moon, which somehow found gaps to illuminate the tortuous path ahead of me. But this light brought no comfort. It only outlined the sinister shapes that seemed to follow me with invisible gazes. In a desperate attempt to document what I was experiencing, I took out my cell phone, hoping that technology could be my witness. But as if the darkness itself was laughing at my attempt, the device refused to work. The screen was black, as if all the energy had been sucked out of the room. I was alone, truly alone, with no one to hear my screams or witness the fear that consumed me. Each topic in this section of my story seemed to sink me deeper into a nightmare from which I couldn't wake up. The ruins, with their shifting corridors and whispering voices, had become a prison. And I, its newest inhabitant, was beginning to question not only my fate, but my own sanity. Was it possible to escape from a place that seemed to exist outside of time and space, that fed on my fear and hopelessness? When I finally found what seemed to be the exit from the ruins, a momentary relief was quickly replaced by horror as I realized that the door I had entered did not lead me back to the world I knew. Instead, it opened onto an unknown part of the forest, a place that didn't appear on any map, where the trees stood like distorted sentinels with branches that intertwined to form faces contorted in expressions of agony. The atmosphere there was different, charged with an energy that made the air seem heavy, difficult to breathe. A thin mist began to form, snaking between the trees, and in the shadows it created, I could swear that dark figures were watching me, disappearing whenever I tried to focus my gaze on them. The fear I felt in those ruins was now multiplied, a feeling of being hunted in a game of which I didn't know the rules. Driven by an instinct for survival, I tried to retrace my steps, desperately seeking the way back to the ruins, to anywhere that would take me away from that cursed forest. But when I reached where the ruins should have been, I found only emptiness. They had simply disappeared, as if swallowed up by the earth, leaving behind only the memory of my despair. The darkness of the night became even more oppressive, and with it a feeling of absolute isolation. The figures in the shadows seemed to get closer, and the fog thickened, making every step a struggle. My heart beat at a frantic pace. Every whisper of the wind seemed to carry voices that mocked my situation, and the reality of my situation began to set in. I was lost, not just physically, but in a labyrinth of fear and madness from which I could see no way out. Every element of this section of the story was not just a continuation of the terror, but a downward spiral into madness. The ruins, the forest, the shadows, and the fog formed a setting where fear became tangible, palpable, a constant presence that accompanied me at every uncertain step. I, James, had ignored the warnings, had defied the unknown, and now I found myself trapped in a nightmare from which I didn't know if I could wake up. In that forest, the feeling of being stalked intensified. A stalking not physical but psychological. A sadistic game where I was the prey and the predator delighted in my growing hopelessness. I could feel its presence, an entity that blamed me, that accused me with whispers and distorted laughter. A voice that seemed to come from inside my own head, saying that the price of my arrogance would be paid in fear and pain. In the midst of my desperate escape, I found a hovel, an old rotting structure that seemed as out of place as I was in the forest. With my heart pounding with hope as much as terror, I entered, seeking refuge, or perhaps a way out of my nightmare. But inside, I found only more horrors. Ritualistic symbols covered the walls, and on the floor, marks suggesting that this place had been the scene of unspeakable acts. It was as if every shadow in that hovel whispered stories of pain and suffering, and I had unwittingly become part of them. The entity, that evil force that I had unleashed with my disrespect, wasn't content to just chase me through the forest. It manifested itself inside the hovel, a presence so oppressive that it sucked the air from my lungs, a shadow that moved independently of the light, forming grotesque figures that danced on the walls. The fear became physical, squeezing my chest, suffocating me with the certainty that I was not alone. That night, the storm came, as if nature itself had turned against me. Lightning cut through the sky, and the sound of thunder competed with the whispers and laughter that filled the hut. I was trapped, physically by the hovel that refused to release its prey, and mentally by the guilt and terror that consumed me. Every flash of lightning brought a vision of shadows moving, of eyes glowing in the darkness, a cacophony of fear that enveloped me completely. It was then that I found the book, an old ritual tome hidden under the floorboards. With a mixture of hope and despair, I flipped through its pages, looking for something that could protect me, that could ward off the entity, and allow me to escape from this madness. But every word I read, every symbol I tried to decipher only seemed to deepen the darkness around me, as if, instead of a way out, I had only found a way to sink deeper into the nightmare. Every moment in that hovel, every shadow and every whisper served as a cruel reminder of my situation. I was in a game of which I didn't know the rules, and the entity, that ancient and evil force, was always one step ahead of me, leading me deeper into its labyrinth of terror. The storm outside intensified, as if each clap of thunder were an echo of my own despair, and each flash of lightning only revealed more of the nightmare in which I was trapped. Inside the hovel, the entity became bolder, its manifestations more physical, shadows that stretched and twisted in ways that defied reality, a macabre dance that surrounded me, suffocated me, isolated me even more from the world I knew. In my desperate search for answers, for some way to protect myself, I confronted the entity. My voice, although shaky, demanded to know what it wanted from me. The answer came not in words, but in a distorted laugh that seemed to come from all directions. A mockery of my situation, of my inability to understand the depth of my mistake. It was a laugh that carried centuries of pain and suffering, and now seemed to revel in my terror. In the midst of the chaos, I found an old ritual book, its pages worn by age, its words a mystery shrouded in shadows. In my ignorance and desperation, I tried to use one of the rituals, a spell that promised protection against evil forces. But the words, when spoken, seemed to be lost in the wind, and the effect was immediate, but not as I had hoped. Instead of driving the entity away, the ritual only seemed to strengthen it, as if each syllable was an invitation for it to come even closer, a provocation to its dark existence. It was then that the entity began to materialize before me, its form a mass of shadows and distortion, a vision that defied my comprehension and assaulted my sanity. It wasn't a fixed form, but something that changed, that flowed like mist, with parts that seemed human, and at the same time grotesquely distorted. Eyes that weren't eyes watched me, mouths that weren't mouths whispered threats, and I, paralyzed with terror, couldn't find the strength to look away. Every second in the presence of that entity was a torment, an agony that transcended the physical and invaded the soul, leaving scars that I knew, even at that moment, would never heal. I was trapped in a nightmare made real, a sinister game where every move was mine, and every consequence a deeper plunge into the abyss of terror. That night, the hovel, which was already a haven of horrors, became a blazing inferno. Without explanation or warning, the fire began to consume the structure, the flames dancing as if they were alive. Fed by the darkness and fear that permeated the place, I ran, not just from the flames, but from the entity that seemed to delight in my hopelessness. The heat was suffocating, the light from the flames distorting the shadows, turning the hovel into a stage for the last act of an endless nightmare. The forest welcomed me again, a familiar but no less terrifying darkness. I ran without direction, guided only by the instinct to flee, to escape that relentless pursuit. The entity, however, was not willing to let me go so easily. It played with me, a prey in its territory, distorting the reality around me, making every shadow seem like a threat, every whisper of the wind a promise of pain. Then the visions began, hallucinations or perhaps glimpses of a future that awaited me, each one more horrible than the last. I saw myself in various forms, each one ending in death and despair, as if the entity wanted to show me that there was no way out, that my fate was already sealed, and that all I had left was terror and agony. In the midst of that madness, I found a circle of ancient stones, a place that seemed to pulsate with an energy of its own, unlike anything I had felt up until then. In the center, a figure stood out, human in form, but shrouded in shadows, as if it were part of the night itself. She called out to me, her voice a mixture of plea and command, and against all logic, I found myself walking towards her, as if unable to resist her summons. That moment, in that circle of stones under the moonlight, was a turning point. The surrounding shadows seemed to thicken, and the figure in the center, a manifestation of the souls disturbed by my invasion, began to become clearer, more defined. I had entered sacred territory, disrespected its traditions, and now I was facing the consequences of my actions. A condemnation that I still didn't fully understand, but which I felt with growing terror was more terrible than anything I had imagined. The figure in the center of the stone circle, now clearer to my terrified eyes, revealed itself as the personification of the souls that had been disturbed by my arrogance. They stared at me with eyes that glowed with a supernatural light, their faces contorted, not only in pain, but in a fury that crossed the barriers of death. My attempts to apologize, to explain, to beg for mercy were met with a cold silence and then a spectral violence that threw me to the ground, invisible forces compressing me as if they wanted to crush me against the earth itself. They then spoke, not with words, but with voices that echoed directly in my mind, a cacophony of accusations and condemnations. They told me that my punishment would be eternal, an existence condemned to wander the forest, lost, forgotten by all, a specter among the shadows, trapped in a limbo of endless terror. The forest, the ruins, the hovel, everything was now my prison, a labyrinth from which I would never find my way out. In my desperate attempt to escape, I somehow escaped the circle, running blindly through the forest that seemed to close in around me, the trees like sentinels condemning my escape. But then, spectral hands appeared out of nowhere, grabbing onto me with relentless force, pulling me down into the earth, as if they wanted to bury me alive, to make me part of that damned place. And then there was a moment of calm, an absolute silence that was both a relief and a harbinger of even greater horrors. I was alone, abandoned in the darkness, every sound, every movement in the shadows a reminder of my doom. The forest was no longer just a landscape. It was a living entity, breathing and moving around me, every tree, every stone a testimony to my failure and my fate. This part of my story was not just a continuation of my nightmare. It was confirmation that there was no way out, that the entity, the shadows, the forest had closed in on me, swallowing me whole in an abyss of despair and madness from which I could never escape. I had crossed a line from which there was no return, and now I was paying the price for my arrogance, lost in a world of shadows and terror that I myself had unleashed. When I woke up, I briefly harbored the hope that it was all just a bad dream, an illusion born of tiredness and stress. However, reality imposed itself cruelly when I realized that I was still in that forest. The morning sun, unable to dispel the darkness that now inhabited my interior. Worse, my body was marked with symbols I didn't recognize, etched into my skin, as if they were a permanent reminder of my encounter with the supernatural, a property marked by the entity and the souls I had disturbed. The whispers hadn't stopped. On the contrary, they were now a constant murmur that followed me wherever I went. My name, whispered by the wind, accompanied by distant laughter, created a soundtrack for my now cursed existence. The chase had changed, no longer a physical hunt, but a psychological torture, a hunt for what was left of my sanity. With every attempt to escape, every effort to find a way out, the forest proved to be a living adversary, changing, adapting to keep me trapped within its borders. The trees seemed to move. The paths closed behind me, and the feeling of being watched was now my constant companion, a shadow that followed me, mocking every hope of escape. Over time, the distinction between day and night began to fade, each moment becoming an eternity of fear and despair. The apparitions became more frequent, more intense, manifestations of the entity and the souls I had disturbed, each one a reminder of my fate. They didn't touch me, but their presence was a physical weight, a pressure that crushed me, reminding me that I was trapped in an endless cycle of terror. This part of my journey was the darkest, a period when I began to accept my situation, my doom. The forest, the ruins, the hovel, the apparitions, everything merged into a reality that I knew I couldn't escape. Hope had vanished, leaving in its place only the certainty that my existence would be an eternal walk through darkness, a pilgrim in a sanctuary of endless terror. In my desolation, I found the ruins again, as if they were calling me back to the point of origin of my fall. At that moment, I realized that this was where it all had to end, or perhaps where my eternal damnation really began. Moved by a last thread of hope, or perhaps by a need to face my destiny, I decided to perform an apology ritual, using the fragments of the ritual book I had found in the hut. With my hands shaking and my voice failing, I recited the words, more like a plea than a spell, hoping to somehow appease the fury of those souls and the entity I had defied. But it was too late. The shadows around me thickened, and the feeling of being watched intensified until it became unbearable. The air became heavy, charged with the promise of an approaching end, an outcome that I knew would not bring relief or oblivion. The laughter and whispers grew, a sinister chorus that celebrated my defeat, my capitulation in the face of the inevitable. Then the shadows enveloped me, a darkness so complete that it swallowed not only the light, but hope itself. I felt my essence being drained, pulled into the earth, a sensation of being absorbed by the very ground beneath my feet. It was as if the ruins, the forest, the entity, were claiming what was rightfully theirs, erasing my existence, my identity, everything I was or could have been. In the end, only silence remained. The ruins returned to their deathly stillness, as if nothing had happened, as if no one had disturbed their repose. But somewhere, in the shadows between the stones, in the darkness under the trees, my story remains, a warning to those who, out of arrogance or ignorance, dare to challenge the traditions and mysteries that are best left alone. My journey ends here, not with redemption or understanding, but with a somber silence, an echo of a terror that cannot be extinguished, a shadow that stretches beyond death.